Good evening and welcome to the MTA's Town Hall about the Interborough Express, or IBX. I'm Sean Fitzpatrick, Deputy Chief of Staff at MTA Construction and Development. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. The Interborough Express, or IBX, is a proposed transit project that would link Brooklyn and Queens using an existing underutilized freight right-of-way that runs from Jackson Heights in Queens all the way to Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. It's a potentially transformative project, one that would not just connect those neighborhoods along the right-of-way, but serve a vital purpose for the entire region, better connecting folks throughout New York City and beyond. Since we last held a virtual town hall on this project in September of last year, we've made a lot of progress. First, as Governor Hochul announced in her State of the State address earlier this year, we have completed our planning and environmental linkages study, and selected light rail as the preferred mode for the project. We'll get into tonight what that means and what led to that decision. The study also unveiled a preliminary list of planned stations and detailed some of our planning and engineering thinking about the project. One purpose of tonight's town hall is going to be to walk through that study that we completed and what its implications are for the project. We'll also answer questions about it from you. More recently, earlier this month, the governor announced that we've been able to select the consultant for the environmental review process for the project. This is a major milestone that marks the kickoff of that environmental review process, and it will be a more intensive stage of planning, engineering, and public engagement. This town hall is also meant to explain that process and answer your questions about what the next steps are for the project. It's also a chance to hear more of your feedback and answer your questions. Since this project was first announced, we've received hundreds and hundreds into the thousands of questions, of comments, and of really helpful feedback. And this will explain a little bit what we've heard throughout that process and obviously lay out our next steps for hearing even more from the communities that this project will serve. Tonight, Mike Schiffer, Senior Vice President of Regional Planning at MTA Construction and Development, will give a presentation that describes the project in more detail and explains those recent progress that I described above. Following that presentation, we'll answer your questions. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom app. If you submit a written question, our team will be reviewing questions as they come in. We won't be able to answer every question individually. We have many, many people on the Zoom tonight, which we're very, very grateful for. But we will try to get to as many topics as we possibly can. You can also view previous town halls and the video of this town hall on our website. The project webpage is new.mta.info/IBX. That's new.mta.info/IBX. And we also have a wealth of information on that site about the project, including things that might answer questions that we aren't able to get to tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us. We're very grateful for your time and attention. We look forward to this being just the latest in what will be a very, very fruitful public engagement process as we shape this project going forward. With that, let me introduce Mike Schiffer. He is, as I said, Senior Vice President for Regional Planning here at MTA Construction and Development. Mike has extensive experience in transportation planning at transit agencies and top universities all across North America. That's the US and Canada. He's been leading the planning effort for this project and for planning future-looking projects throughout the MTA portfolio over his more than 10 years with the MTA. Mike will give a presentation and then answer your questions. I'll turn it over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sean. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to present this to you again today. I'm going to review some of the aspects of the Interborough Express proposal for those of you who haven't seen it before, just to get you up to speed and refresh the memory of those of you who've seen this already. And then we're going to talk more about a couple of things, most notably our selection of the transit mode that would best fit this environment, as well as what went into the process of selecting station locations, and finally the environmental review process moving forward. In terms of the context, the Interborough Express would provide a transformative new transit connection between Brooklyn and Queens. It would be built along, as Sean said, a lightly used freight corridor that extends from Bay Ridge to Jackson Heights, and it would preserve freight service and capacity as well. This line has been around for a while. It's been around since 1876. I mean, it's been around for over 100 years. And in fact, it carried passengers up until about 1924. At that time, it was switched to exclusive freight use. Here you can see an image of the East New York station back in 1924 and what that platform looks like today. We probably won't reuse that platform, but we do anticipate a station at this location once again. The northern portion of the corridor in Queens, the northern 3 miles roughly is owned by CSX, and the southern portion in Brooklyn at roughly 11 miles is owned by the Long Island Railroad and operated by the New York and Atlantic Railway for local freight service. It currently carries up to 3 freight trains a day. Part of the reason why this is such an exciting project, it really is from a transportation planning perspective, it hits a lot of marks very effectively. It's an exceptionally diverse study area. As you would imagine, looking at the center of Brooklyn and Queens, you've got a very diverse population. You've got a population that has only 1 and 2 car ownership. And you've got a population that could really use the mobility that this could provide. Also, it's a substantial population. Almost 1 million people live within a half mile of the line. And many more people will benefit from the line by transferring from subways and other local transit services, such as buses and the Long Island Railroad. In addition, along this corridor, again, within a half mile, there's over 250,000 jobs, and that's growing. We've seen the growth really of intra and interborough travel that doesn't involve Manhattan over the last few decades. It's really grown pretty substantially. And it's important to be able to serve that population. It's also important to be able to serve and continue to serve the travel to Manhattan as well. And so this, by connecting up to 17 subway lines in the Long Island Railroad, this has the ability to provide a significant amount of mobility for generations to come. As I mentioned, the Interborough Express, or IBX as we call it, would serve Brooklyn and Queens residents and employees without needing to travel through Manhattan. And we project, based on the mode selected, that it would carry up to 115,000 weekday riders. And as I mentioned, it can connect up to 17 subway lines in the Long Island Railroad. In fact, the transformation that it could provide is provided with an example where a person traveling from Bushwick to Brooklyn Army Terminal could save up to 26 minutes by taking the Interborough Express and not having to transfer through Manhattan. So this can offer significant time savings for many people. And we know there are so many different folks traveling in so many different ways throughout Brooklyn and Queens. There are many other opportunities for time savings, which is a key factor when you consider the effectiveness of public transportation. Now, there's also freight in this corridor, and I should note that we're working closely with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, who are conducting their own study of the Cross Harbor Freight Program. They're looking at how to effectively assess rail alternatives for freight movement throughout the region's network. They've done a Tier 1 environmental impact statement already, and they are seeking a notice of intent for the Tier 2 environmental impact statement. So they will measure for accumulated impacts, including the impact on and with our Interborough Express proposal. So I should note that while the freight program is not an MTA project, we're working closely with the Port Authority to ensure that the projects are compatible and don't preclude one another. So on to the planning study. So in January of 2023, Governor Hochul announced the results of what we call a planning and environmental linkages study. The study set out to select the transit mode, the most effective transit mode in this corridor. It set out to identify potential station locations, not set in stone yet, but they're potential station locations, and advance additional engineering, planning, and environmental evaluation. And we started by looking broadly at 5 transit modes, which included subways, automated guideway transit, conventional rail, light rail, and bus rapid transit. Subway and automated guideway options were eliminated through a fairly rigorous process that looked at what it would take to support them. The issue was the significant property requirements that would be necessary to be able to support the corridor with their space needs. The remaining 3 alternatives underwent a more detailed planning and design, and those included conventional rail, which is like the trains you could ride on the Long Island Railroad or Metro North or New Jersey Transit, light rail, and we'll show some examples of that in just a little bit, and bus rapid transit. And that's more than just SBS on a reserved lane on an arterial road. SBS and bus rapid transit in this case is a dedicated roadway that's almost like a rapid transit line with its own dedicated station. So I'll talk a little bit about these 3. When we talk about conventional rail, again, examples include what we have right now for our commuter services. We're talking about rolling stock or cars that are configured more like transit vehicles. So they'd have fewer seats than a typical commuter train, and they would probably have more doors than a typical commuter train, and they would be more subway-like in their seating configuration. They would operate on separate tracks adjacent to the freight railroad, and they would draw their power from electric third rail. One of the things when we looked at conventional rail that we noted is that you would need cars of a specific smaller design so it could fit through some of the more constrained areas of this particular line. We also looked at bus rapid transit. And as I mentioned, bus rapid transit here in this context is more than what we see with SBS in New York. It's really a dedicated busway. Some examples not far away include Connecticut outside of Hartford, as well as up in Boston, the Silver Line, and other areas around the United States. You can try out bus rapid transit. It's buses that operate on their own dedicated roadway with dedicated stations. And these buses would be fully electric with rechargeable battery powered vehicles. And then the third mode that we considered is light rail transit. So light rail transit in this case are modern rail vehicles that are flexible enough to operate in many environments. They can operate in mixed traffic on streets, they can operate on a railroad, they can operate through tunnels, and they can take very sharp turns and carry many people, and they accelerate and decelerate very effectively. These are the modern descendants of the trolleys and streetcars of the past. And actually, we've had those around these parts as well in the past. But you don't have to go very far to experience these. All you have to do is go to Hoboken or Jersey City to take a ride on the Hudson Bergen Light Rail, and you can see some examples of this mode operating in an urban environment that's nearby. So in terms of analyzing the project modes, we chose light rail. And the reason why we chose it is because based on a number of factors, which I'm going to get into in a moment, it provided the best value for our customers and the best service as well. The running time noted here is 39 minutes end to end. Very few people would ride all the way end to end. You're not necessarily riding from Jackson Heights to Bay Ridge. You're riding intermediately through various parts of the line, connecting to subway lines and buses and so forth. And for those short trips, light rail trains are very effective because they have an effective acceleration and deceleration profile, so they can start and stop effectively and smoothly. They also have a significant amount of capacity. Each train of 2 units, 2 multi-section units, If you put them together, you could have 360 passengers. That's expandable to a third unit if you need to expand your capacity in the future. But as designed, this has the capacity to handle 115,000 projected daily weekday riders. And based on this, the cost per daily rider in 2027 inflation adjusted dollars is about $48,000. Now, as an example here, we'll look at this, and this is all outlined in the reports that you can get to online. Light rail, as I mentioned, it's effective in terms of its profile, in terms of speed, its ability to board passengers and let them off effectively as well. So it has good capacity. And it also, and on the other hand, bus rapid transit, part of the issue there, we looked at it very seriously, but quite frankly, the issue was the articulated buses that are available to us in the US, two-section articulated buses like the ones we see around town, do not have the capacity of a multi-section light rail train. And so you'd have to run the buses much more frequently, and you start running into the limitations of traffic, especially in Queens, where you would have to turn the buses in city streets to get them to operate in the other direction. So there were some significant challenges with respect to bus rapid transit, and that would affect reliability as well. Light rail can operate on the right of way, on reserved right of way for most of it. There is a portion where it would need to leave the right of way to traverse and get around a cemetery, and we're looking at all options to see if there's other ways to do that. But the point is that bus rapid transit, because buses are single-ended, you need to basically turn them around and find enough space to be able to turn them. So they could get bogged down on city streets in that manner. In terms of constructability, light rail's flexibility means, like I said, it can operate on the railroad, it can operate at grade as well, and avoid various pinch points. The other thing is, basically light rail vehicles are more available when you look at the availability of transit vehicles. There's very few manufacturers of transit vehicles, and light rail vehicles can be procured without a lot of modification for specific purposes, because they're operated in many different cities around North America. So they have potentially a larger pool of potential suppliers than traditional MTA rail rolling stock. Both conventional rail and bus rapid transit, as I mentioned, would require some modifications to be able to operate. The East New York Tunnel is an example, which I showed at the beginning of this presentation, has some space constraints. And so for emergency egress, light rail allows you to get out of the vehicle itself at almost grade level, whereas conventional rail trains require platforms, and quite frankly, in the tunnel, you're quite constrained there. So the engineers are looking at all ways we can facilitate that. So really, those are some of the benefits of the light rail vehicles. And then most notably, again, thanks to its high ridership, it offers effectively a cost of $48,000 per daily rider. The construction budget is $5.5 billion in 2027 dollars. That's a lot of money, but it's actually more cost effective than conventional rail, which would be more due to the need to build more tunnels. And it also is more effective from a cost perspective than bus rapid transit, because bus rapid transit doesn't have the capacity to move as many riders. So that kind of sums up the analysis at a very, very high level. I encourage you to look at the materials that are posted online that get into a lot more detail about the selection from a technical perspective. Next are station locations. So the current station program was developed so that we could maximize transfers within the MTA network. as well as transfers to major arterial roadways, many of which have significant bus lines as well. Right now, there are 19 proposed stations on the IBX, and 13 of those would have transfers to subways, and they would have transfers to up to 17 subway lines. Some of those transfers aren't direct transfers. You have to walk sometimes a block or two to make the transfer, but we feel you could do that within the system using the Omni card or associated fare media in the same manner that many other people make transfers on modern day transit lines as well. It also offers transfers to the Long Island Railroad at Atlantic Avenue. So when we looked at the station program, we considered public feedback, and we were heartened to see over 1,000 people drop pins on the electronic map of where they would like to see the stations. And it was no surprise that many of the places where the public wanted to see the stations were where it would make sense. And that was at intersections with subway lines and major arterials. We also looked at ridership. So in other words, what's the catchment area of a particular station, or what's the likelihood of transfers from another transit line to the Interborough Express at that location? And as I mentioned, we looked at transfers. We looked at constructability as well. Where can you reasonably construct a station? And then how can you effectively space these stations along the line? There's going to be more advanced station level conceptual design once the environmental review phase starts to really take shape. That's where we and our consultants will work with the public in terms of some of the contextual sensitivity and needs and really the environment around specific stations. And that gets into things like accessing the line, whether you're transferring from transit, whether you're accessing it from a bike, as a pedestrian, how does it relate to its environment? We're also looking at the engineering and planning of the line. And the line itself, you can't just throw a couple of transit tracks down next to the freight. It really needs to be reconfigured. It doesn't mean we're going to move outside of the bounds of the right-of-way, but what it means is that the right-of-way itself may need to be reconfigured in a manner that you see here on this diagram, so that you could basically fit transit services as well as maintain the existing freight operation. But that means rebuilding up to 45 bridges along the way. And that's where a lot of the expense is incurred, especially because some of those bridges include elevated trains as well as roadways. So you have a lot of complexity throughout this right of way. So where does that bring us in terms of next steps? Well, this project represents a rare opportunity to really leverage our existing network effectively. We already have right of way. We have this line. Let's use it to its highest and best use and build a new transit line. And with the identification of light rail transit as the preferred mode, the next step is going to be to begin what we call the scoping phase of the environmental review. And so that involves looking more at the detail of the design of the line, how it intersects with different things, and of course the stations themselves. And that's where you come in handy, because we need you, we need your support, and we need your engagement. We need you to explain to us some of the key constraints and things that the designers, the planners, and the engineers need to be aware of from a community perspective. So we look forward to engaging you as we move ahead in this process. In terms of the environmental review is something we conduct to maintain eligibility for federal funding. And we also conduct it because it's the right thing to do. We need to understand and look thoroughly at how this process will impact the neighborhoods, what's its effectiveness, and what we need to take into account to make it the best thing we can make it for the communities that it serves. Throughout this process, as I mentioned, we're going to elicit and consider your comments through public outreach and hearings. As the governor announced on August 2nd, a consultant, WSP, has been selected to assist MTA with this. And they're going to support us with some of the station level conceptual design that I was talking about, as well as they're going to assist us, of course, with the preparation of the environmental impact statement. So we're still very early in this process. Okay, I don't want to leave you with a sense that this thing is going to be done within a year or two. It's going to take a while. Quite frankly, the environmental review alone is a 2-year process when a notice of intent, it's called, is issued, and that we anticipate probably at some point in the next few months. So the environmental review is conducted. Then there is, of course, a process where it's looked at. There's preliminary engineering that may take place then if it's decided to advance this project. And then, of course, there's the whole concept of funding and whether it fits in our capital program. And then, of course, there's the actual construction of the project itself. I should also point out that this is happening in parallel with our current capital planning process. And our capital planning process includes a 20-year needs assessment where we look first and foremost at the state of good repair of our existing network. And that's absolutely critical. We're going to be coming back to you, my colleagues will be coming back to you more about the state of good repair and the 20-year needs assessment in the coming weeks and months. But that's very important. As part of that, we look at not only the existing system, but we recognize as a growing region and as a region that's changing its travel patterns, we need to be agile and we need to consider how people are using transit differently. And so for that, we're doing a comparative evaluation of the more than 24 system expansion proposals that have been made through the years. And we're looking at them, including Interborough Express, based on things such as ridership, the cost of a particular line, as well as time saved, equity, and environmental support as well. We look at resiliency, for example, and a number of other attributes. And so we're comparing these. The reason why we're bringing Interborough Express forward now is because we looked at this and the early sense was that this really hits the mark on so many of these targets that it certainly got the attention of the public. It's had the attention of the public for quite some time. The Regional Plan Association had a version of this out there for a while, as well as others have seen the promise of transit in this corridor over time. And so the governor, as well as a lot of key planners throughout the region and leaders, saw that this may be a promising project. And so that's why we're doing the work we're doing now to better understand how it could support our region. So with that, I'd like to thank you and switch over to question and answer. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mike, for talking us through that. As he said, we will now go into questions and answers. To ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box on the Zoom app or desktop or wherever you're accessing this Zoom. We'll be answering as many questions as we can over the next half hour or so, and we'll be consolidating questions as they come in so we can get to as much as we possibly can. So let's start with a couple of questions that came in advance about the sort of general process, and then we'll get to some of the more specific questions that are coming in tonight. One piece of this that I think is worth sort of explaining in a little more detail, Mike, talk us through why did we do a planning and environmental linkages study? Why aren't we just out there with shovels and pickaxes tonight? What is the purpose of the process so far?
So, costs a lot of money to get out there with shovels and pickaxes. So we need help with that. We need funding for that. And to do the right thing, we really want to understand what's the best and most effective technology that's available to us to support mobility in this area. And so the whole point of the planning and environmental linkages study was to determine feasibility and identify the most effective mode, transit mode. And really the purpose of the environmental review itself is to evaluate the project and to document whether it has the potential for environmental impacts. And as part of this process, we'll also ask the public for further input, as I noted, on this project, and consider comments within the scope of the project.
That makes sense to me. I guess another question, let me just note that, Mike mentioned that the planning and environmental linkages study is available for anyone to review. That's at new.mta.info/IBX, new.mta.info/IBX. If you go to the sort of additional documents at the bottom of that page, you'll be able to review the document in all of its glory. One question that we're getting a lot of folks asking that I think is worth addressing sort of early days is the question of why does the project go from Bay Ridge to Jackson Heights? Why doesn't it continue further? So, and specifically, why doesn't it continue to the Bronx, as some previous iterations of this proposal included? Mike, can you talk us through some of the constraints that lead to the project being some of the both constraints and also exciting developments in the Bronx that have led to us choosing the limits that we've set out tonight?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying the reason why it terminates at Jackson Heights as opposed to another location in Queens is due to the large number of potential onward connections that are served by the various transit options that are in Jackson Heights. With respect to the Bronx, as many folks know in the Bronx is soon to be served by Penn Station Access, which is going to bring Metro North service to the Bronx. And it will connect the Bronx to Midtown Manhattan, to Penn Station, as well as connect to various locations going out further into Westchester and beyond. The Penn Access project is underway. Construction is underway right now on 4 stations in the Bronx. One is at Co-op City, Parkchester, Van Nest, Morris Park, and
Hunts Point.
Hunts Point, thank you. The line itself is owned by Amtrak. And so without getting in Amtrak's way, Amtrak's Northeast Corridor operates through that line. It's a very important line to the economy of the United States and the Northeast, of course. And so we are committed to not obstruct Amtrak service on that line in that right of way. And so what that means is you're building a platform for passengers to get on and off the trains from. You're building 2 new tracks for Metro North trains to stop at, and you're rebuilding Amtrak's tracks to get around that. And there's an additional freight track as well along that corridor. So quite frankly, the existing corridor is completely subscribed, and IBX, because it will run trains up to every 5 minutes, requires its own 2 tracks. And so in order to operate IBX in the Bronx, you would need to acquire a lot of private land, which would bring up the cost substantially. And quite frankly, some areas you don't have that option. For example, on the Hellgate Bridge itself, you have room for 1 additional track. If you consider the 2.
Sorry, Mike, remind folks what the Hellgate Bridge is and where it is.
Oh, sure. The Hellgate Bridge actually connects to Queens, goes across the Hellgate, the East River, and into the Bronx. And it is the connection that the Penn Access trains from the Bronx will take to get into Penn Station. And so if you were going to link IBX to that, you would need to widen or build onto that structure in some manner. And again, the cost is pretty substantial. We're not saying it can never be done, But we see the opportunity of building this first and foremost. We want to get this done because it's available to us. We're going to have and are very excited about the new Bronx service for Metro North as well. And there may be opportunities for future transfers, but we'll see. We want to get one stage at a time.
Thanks, Mike. I think it is an important question, and one where, as you note, the great benefit of Penn Station access, in addition to all the incredible benefits of the project, is that it is under construction today. And so we're thrilled to be bringing that service to the Bronx, not on the longer timeline that we're looking at for the Interborough, but sort of, imminently. Let's talk through mode selection a little bit. We certainly have a lot of questions sort of asking us to tease out a little further how we landed at light rail. And sort of what we see its advantages are, and what sort of were some of the disadvantages that led us to discount the other options that we looked at. So you talked a little bit about how the procurement of light rail might be one key advantage of it. Can you talk a little bit more about why we think that it will be cost beneficial and sort of just beneficial from a sort of capital program perspective for us to look to light rail as the vehicles we'd be procuring?
Well, light rail cars are used in hundreds of cities around the world, and at least about 40 in North America. I was surprised when I started counting them up. A lot of cities use light rail cars, and a lot of light rail cars are a very, very similar design. So there are a number of manufacturers of cars that you can get that are fairly standardized. Not fully standardized, but standardized enough where that without a lot of customization, they could work effectively in this environment. So subway cars, on the other hand, and commuter rail cars are highly specialized vehicles designed to operate within very specific environments of specific constraints. And so really, I'm not a procurement expert, but from what I understand, from a procurement standpoint, there may be more options with light rail vehicles. That said, that's not the only reason, of course. We also look at their flexibility and adaptability in a variety of different operating environments.
I don't claim to be a procurement expert myself, but I think it is a key example of the MTA sort of learning from challenges and challenges that I think we're doing a good job overcoming in the rest of the program, but trying to figure out how to be sort of most nimble and effective with a project like this. Another key question that we've gotten about light rail, though, is that a light rail's capacity of an individual train is potentially lower than what a sort of full-length commuter rail train would be. Do we think that light rail has the capacity to fully meet the demand? And is it possible to, if demand exceeds our expectations, is it possible to add additional capacity through light rail, through the light rail system in the future?
The answer is yes. Actually, what you have is a multi-unit vehicle that it's a large kind of articulated vehicle, and our initial concept for light rail operation in this is to have 2 of these vehicles. So each vehicle can carry up to 180 people. So basically you've got a train that can carry 360 people. But the benefit of light rail is that it can operate at very high frequency. That is, it can operate up to maybe a 5-minute interval between trains. Sometimes it'll be a little longer, but it depends on the time of day and what the demand profile is. But that's the beauty of light rail. It's very adaptable. It doesn't have to operate to a specific timetable. It can operate on what they call a headway schedule, if you will. So you have a tremendous amount of flexibility. Also, although we're envisioning 2-unit trains initially, it could be expanded to 3-unit trains. The platforms are being designed to be able to accommodate expansion in that manner.
That strikes me as another good example of us sort of trying to thread the needle between, not overbuilding a project, but also, making sure that we're being responsive to potential future changes in conditions. So I certainly appreciate that as an advantage. We've talked about its flexibility light rail as an advantage. That we've also gotten questions, specifically about the street running section. That although it does, save a significant amount of money to the construction costs, there are disadvantages to running on the street as well. Can you talk through? Is there precedent for a line like this having a street running section, and sort of what would we do to make it a success?
So there's several cities that have extensive running of light rail in mixed traffic environments. Places like Toronto, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Jersey City, which I mentioned earlier, Boston, those all come to mind. But it's not without its challenges. Whenever you have areas where you have vehicles and trains sharing right of way or in close proximity, you need to pay a lot of attention to traffic engineering. It's done successfully in many of those cities. Portland's another great example, and there's many others that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But clearly, there's options to visit some places, including just across the Hudson River here, to see what it looks like in those environments. It will require very close coordination with partners such as the New York City Department of Transportation and others to figure out what's the best way to effectively accommodate all needs there. An earlier iteration of this proposal had the light rail crossing a lot of streets in Brooklyn. We were fortunate enough to come up with a design where we were able to get it in the cut with the freight service. But there's still some areas where we need to pay a lot of attention to how we can effectively overcome obstacles.
I think it was, folks will remember from the presentation, or perhaps they won't, but they can look back at the presentation we gave in September about that ability to sort of remove the vast majority of the grade crossings from the light rail alternative in Brooklyn. And that was a sort of key development that I think was a major factor in allowing us to choose light rail as the ultimate pick. You've touched on this, and I think it's relevant to sort of get into in a little more detail. We've gotten some questions about the need to widen the right of way or fortify the existing right of way. As the diagram that you showed spoke to, there are sections of the right of way that even if in theory the property line, even if the property line is wide enough to accommodate 2 tracks for the IBX as well as maintaining freight access, a fair amount of construction work is going to be needed in order to accomplish that. Can you say anything more about sort of what that process would look like and what our planning process will entail on this front?
Well, I think you kind of answered the question there. A lot more is going to be needed in terms of design to get it to work effectively. Really, this illustration is very simplified, but it gives you a rough idea of how to fit light rail in constrained environments. And really what that involves is looking at what the property constraints are, what are the constraints of the physical attributes around the line, around the right of way, and how can it fit and what needs to be constructed or reconstructed. And that's where, as we get into conceptual engineering phases and so forth, that will be uncovered in much greater detail.
I will also take advantage now to, especially because we have the slide. Oh, leave the slide up the slide up for a second, Mike. I want to point out the photo on the left of the slide, which is a photo from our Long Island Railroad third track project, which opened to the public last year and is part of this sort of successful push to significantly increase the capacity of the Long Island Railroad. That required the reconstruction of a substantial number of bridges, and we were able to use innovative techniques, sort of constructing a bridge offsite and then being able to sort of push it into place literally over the course of a weekend with much more minimal disruption to service and traffic than sort of would have otherwise been required. So I think this is a daunting challenge as we look at this project, but it is one where we have a track record of success, and I think some very smart engineers who have come up with some very innovative ways to address it. That project, was ultimately able to be completed at $100 million under budget and on time, which obviously we take a fair amount of pride in. Yeah, I think this is a key constraint of the right of way and is part of what makes the cost estimate that you described. A lot of it is in the reconstruction of these bridges, but I think we have a good track record for getting that type of work accomplished. It relates, or we've gotten a lot of questions also about sort of this, we're talking about, we will take every effort to, and the slide you just jumped to briefly is just to note, this is pulled from the planning and environmental linkages study that you can find on the website. So folks don't need to screenshot it rapidly. They can get to it at new.mta.info/IBX. But you can go back to the Q&A slide. Another question that I think is related to this, how do we fit within the existing right of way, is will there be property acquisition needed? And what can we say about the potential need to go outside of the right of way?
I think it's too early to tell, really. It's primarily within the right of way of existing MTA and CSX's right of way. And so we're talking to CSX as well, because they own part of the right of way. And we're talking to the New York City Economic Development Corporation as well, and who owns some of the land near the Brooklyn Army Terminal. That said, as we go through this, it will become more clear whether there are any properties affected.
All right, let's talk about the stations then. You talked through the sort of list of, we flashed up the list of stations, which I think has elicited a lot of excitement. Is that list set in stone? What would you say about sort of the state of the station planning?
It's not set in stone. It's subject to change as we move through the environmental process, but it gives us a really good idea of where we think stations would make sense. Again, at areas where the line intersects with subways or major arterials that are served by buses. It also makes sense to have stations, major traffic generators such as Brooklyn Army Terminal as well. It's not a done deal yet in terms of specific station locations. And in fact, as we move ahead in this next process, we'll have a much better, clearer image of what some of the specific constraints are at specific station sites.
Let's take one example. I think folks were excited to see the Brooklyn Army Terminal station, as you just mentioned. Can you say anything more about the collaboration that we're undertaking in order to make that station possible?
Well, as I mentioned, we're working closely with the New York City Economic Development Corporation, or EDC. The Brooklyn Army Terminal is really a great jobs generator. It's a neighborhood hub, and we're excited to see how effective a station can be. And we also have an opportunity to look at that location for potential vehicle storage and maintenance. And so, again, it's a very important location. There are a lot of needs that may be compatible, but require a significant amount of thought to figure out how they can work effectively together.
And I guess more broadly, I guess I won't pose this to you as a question, but I'll say a statement and see if you have something to add. I guess I'd note that, although we have this list of stations now, as you note, it's not sort of set in stone just yet, but we will be doing much more extensive local engagement, sort of looking at exact locations, exact intersections, how to configure these stations as this process unfolds. That'll be a sort of major focus of the environmental review process. And so, we've gotten some questions about sort of specific, well, can this station be located exactly on this side of the street instead of that side of the street? We don't have answers to those questions just yet, but we are very excited to get into them with local communities as we sort of define the scope. Anything to sort of amend in the way I phrased that?
I think you phrased it perfectly.
All right. Well, I get to chalk up. I answered one. That's good. So what will another question we're getting a lot of, what will the fare policy be? And will there be transfers as we anticipate this being a connector to other lines?
So fares are ultimately the responsibility of the MTA board. So they determine fares. That said, we have been operating on the premise that the fare would be equivalent to a standard subway fare. And the fare would be comparable in that manner, using the same technology that you use to ride the subway, or that you will use to ride the subway once this is put online, to be able to transfer effectively and freely between subway and IBX, the same way you would transfer between subway and bus or subway and subway.
Excellent. Yeah, it's as you note, it's too early to say definitively, but certainly we're anticipating this being, setting this project up for success, and having a really robust transfer policy. Another question we get a lot of that there is a very easy answer to, but so I'll let you take it. Will the system be fully accessible?
Yes.
Excellent. To fill in on that a little more, we're obviously the MTA takes accessibility extraordinarily seriously within the subway system. We're very proud of the commitment to make 95% of the system accessible by 2055, and the sort of unprecedented number of ADA station upgrades included in this current capital program, more than the previous 3 programs combined. So certainly, by law, it has to be the case, but we're very enthusiastic to make this every station here fully accessible, and make sure that its transfers are as well. A question that we got that isn't one of the ones that I had prepared, but I'm very pleased to see come in is, how can the public support the MTA with this project? Do you have thoughts on that, Mike? I guess I have a few, but you go first.
Why don't you share us your thoughts, Sean, on that?
All right. Well, I'd say, we are, as you noted, very early in this process, but sort of continued engagement is, very, very valuable to us. We're grateful for the, thousands of people who have watched these town halls, who have attended them, who have sent in comments and questions. I'd say keep it coming. There is a place to submit comments at new.mta.info/IBX. As we reach future stages of the project, and as we are sort of vying for federal funding, for instance, it'll be extremely valuable to be able to point to the support of the public, and the support of the public, and the ways in which it would be transformative. So, we had the example of somebody commuting from Bushwick to the Brooklyn Army Terminal. That's just one, there's so many permutations and so many potential stories of people whose lives could be positively impacted by this project. And, we'd be very grateful for folks who share their example while we're trying to, put all the engineering details together, to not lose sight of the sort of what this would actually mean for people.
And I can couple onto that, Sean. I think, to your point, I think, again, as I said earlier, if the public finds that this is a very acceptable project to them, also your elected leaders, need to hear from you. And we look forward to hearing from you as well. As everybody, a lot of people have a lot of ideas about transportation in this region, and we know New Yorkers aren't shy about sharing that, and that's good. It makes for a very healthy conversation.
This another question that has prompted, and I guess I'll note too that we have had really, really productive conversations with the elected officials throughout the entire corridor, and we look forward to continuing those. Doesn't hurt for them to hear from you, but I don't want to sort of sound an alarm as if we've had sort of opposition. A related question that has come in is, how will we pay for what is a substantial mega project? What can we say? Obviously, we're very early in the process, but what can we say about our funding strategy?
Well, I think it's very early to say. Certainly, it's up to again, the leadership of the MTA, the leadership of the governments, to determine whether the resources are available to move ahead with something like this. We have designed our process so that we don't preclude eligibility for federal funds. Federal funds, quite frankly, for a project of this magnitude are very, very critical. in that manner. And so it's too early for, and it's not necessarily for me to say how to pay for it. There are a lot of people with a lot of thoughts and a lot of great ideas for how to fund these projects. And we look forward to the robust conversation that will take place as we move forward with that.
I think we're approaching time. Let's try to get a couple of additional questions in before we break. I guess one question that sort of I saw some sort of comments as folks were preparing for the town hall, sort of thinking of what are the this is a different kind of project, as you noted. It's not something that is going into Manhattan. What are the precedents for sort of using a project like this that sort of runs, I think circumferential is the planning term, perhaps, that sort of go around the sort of outer neighborhoods rather than into the central business district? And what can we learn from places like London or others that have implemented similar projects?
Well, I think, there's a number of cities around the world that have circumferential transit lines. I don't want to start naming all of them and leave some out and so forth, but you brought up London as an example as well. The London Overground, the Circle Line, which has been around for over 100 years in London, is a good example of a line that really cuts around the city. But another example in London is not so much circumferential as a reuse of an existing rail corridor, and that's the London Overground system, which shows how you can reuse and leverage an existing corridor to a higher and better use. And of course, there's circumferential subway lines in many cities. And I think it's really important to consider that in this context, especially as we look at the importance and growth really of jobs that are not in the traditional office in the central business district environment, right? There's a lot of jobs in the service industries, in healthcare, and in a variety of other industries throughout the boroughs, where people need to get to destinations, to see friends, to get to healthcare and so forth. And there's so many opportunities, and this really offers the ability to facilitate that connection throughout.
Excellent. Yeah, I think there are plenty of examples. And to answer another question that I saw some folks talking about on Twitter, this is not to replace the G train. This is to supplement that sort of additional, outer borough connections, as you note. We're sort of nearing the end of our time here, so let's end on a couple of questions that speak to what the next steps look like. One that I'll sort of take to start, and you can add to, is a question of how are we going to be communicating with the communities during the environmental review phase? I think this is going to be an extremely open and collaborative process. There are a lot of formal requirements that come along with the environmental review process related to notice and holding a certain number of meetings. We will not just meet those, but we will exceed it, engaging through local community groups, engaging sort of in-person, online. Forums like this are great because they do, I think, offer a the ability for somebody to tune in while they're cooking dinner for their kids, but they also have disadvantages. And so we'll be doing a wide variety in partnership with our, I think, really extraordinary government community relations team. So we will be out and about, sort of throughout the entire right of way over the course of this process in informal settings, in addition to sort of the more formal hearings that are dictated by the environmental review process. So take this hearing or this town hall as sort of very much the beginning, and we look forward to not just for the sake, both for the sake of informing the project and making sure that community concerns are taken into account, and also for sort of generating support for the project and making it easier for us to sort of convince the powers that be and those with the funding to make something like this possible.
Well, thanks, Sean. And I see we're just about out of time, but it's been an absolute pleasure to discuss this project again, and I certainly look forward to more conversations about this and more conversations about all the projects that really are garnering the imagination and enthusiasm of folks who want to create a more mobile, more vibrant region. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Yes, thank you, Mike, and thanks for, as always, for your extremely informative and your sharing your wealth of information and experience with us on this. As you know, we are at time. Before we sign off, let me thank everyone here at the MTA who made this event possible, the folks who helped with the IT and the AV and the project team who has been busily collating your questions. As noted, and I'll say it one more time, you can go to new.mta.info/IBX, new.mta.info/IBX. I managed to remember how to spell info there, which I'm pleased with. To learn more about the project, to view the planning and environmental linkages study in its entirety, as well as to see other sort of documents that we've produced throughout the process, including a frequently asked questions page. We'll also have the recording of this presentation up once it's available from YouTube. Finally, there is a place to add more feedback, and we look forward to and encourage folks to continue staying in touch with us. As noted, we're very much at the beginning of this process and look forward to many more opportunities to engage like tonight and in a lot of different forms. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope it has been an informative and helpful start to the conversation, and we look forward to continuing it with you. Thank you very much.